you. Randy and I have been trying to do an event together forever, and we have false starts and things. But I think the thing is that we're always about politics, and we were waiting for something more important. So here we are.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. I really am. I really mean this. I truly am humbled by the invitation to participate in this and to speak to this issue that is very close to my heart. And in 5 minutes, there are so many things that could be said. I'm going to kind of start with a story, a personal story. 15 years ago, my wife and I, we live in Metro Atlanta. My wife and I had 3 kids, 5, 3, and 1. All of them adopted as newborns, brought home from the hospitals in which they were born. And we were in a really good place. And one day we're sitting there watching television, watching the evening news, and we're watching a report on problems with the foster care system in Georgia. Kids being lost, kids being harmed, and many kids actually dying while in the system. And now it was horrifying, and we were profoundly saddened by it. And so we're talking about that, and I was emoting because I emote. And Marilyn turned to me and she said, "Well, what are we going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a policy person. I'm in an organization called Georgia Center for Opportunity. I'm a policy person." So I naturally went to that. I started talking about, quite frankly, things I didn't know that much about, but I needed Marilyn to be impressed. But I basically started talking about adoption safety and foster care safety, and we need to look into accountability things and all that, government accountability. And she said, "No, what are we going to do? What are you and I going to do?" And I stared at her. I think I hear the kids crying. I see what you did there. I was on my soapbox. You kicked out the soapbox from underneath me, and now you're getting personal and practical. Well, about 2 years later, we adopted a 9-year-old boy, Jesse, and a 3-year-old girl, Lexi. Cousins, actually. Jesse's mom had died, and Lexi's mom's parental rights had been terminated. But it started with that conversation. Marilyn and I are representative in that story of, I think, what goes on often in our communities and in our churches when we think about adoption and when we think about foster care. I went big right away, right? I mean, my thought, I'm drawn to William Wilberforce, she's drawn to Mother Teresa, okay? And so I go big. I start talking about public policy. But to some degree, basically what Marilyn was saying was, I'm not going to let you escape to big without first thinking about what God may be asking us to do personally. Oh, that's just great. And you know what? Another thing that I do, and I do well, is moral indignation. I'm talking Olympic level moral indignation, okay? And moral indignation makes us feel real good. And there's actually science that shows this. We feel good about ourselves when we express moral indignation. She wouldn't let me escape there either, without considering what God might be asking us to do personally. Now, I want to be clear about something. I've never been an unwilling participant in any one of our adoptions. We've got 6 kids now. A year ago, we added a 14-year-old out of the foster care system whose background is just horrific, and she's a sweet, resilient, wonderful girl. But I was not an unwilling participant in this, but I needed a Marilyn, my wife, who said, it's not good enough to just go big. Think macro without thinking micro. To go wholesale instead of thinking retail, right? She was asking me to look a little more closely at what we ought to be doing. The reality is that I think most people in our churches are like me. Particularly, I would say, regular attenders, right? I mean, they hear about these issues and they're moved emotionally. And then there are people like my wife who are the ones who are ready to take action, right? And they want to push us. So here's what I would say, just to wrap up my initial comments. not everybody, as Catherine said, and I absolutely agree with this 100%, without any hesitation, not everybody is called to adoption or foster care. They're not called to adopt a child or foster a child. Many are, but they're not getting that nudge. Because in our churches, we don't necessarily have the mechanisms, the programs, the people to do the nudging. We haven't set up an environment where that concern, that deep concern is cultivated. And I would even argue the burden is cultivated. And then we haven't necessarily developed those people in our congregations, in our parishes, who would be willing to drive it, to drive activity at the church level. It's, as people in this life know, people who have adopted and done foster care, it's a journey. And Kelly Rosati has unbelievable stories about her situation. We've got unbelievable stories in our home. But ultimately, it's a step of faith. I think it's one that we are called to more often than we recognize. And I do think that most people can be supportive of, at the very least, adopted and foster care families. Thank you.
Thank you.